When Martha Henderson nursed a fevered Sioux elder back from death's door in the harsh Dakota winter of 1878, she never imagined that her simple act of compassion would bring 100 painted warriors to her cabin door, not for vengeance, but bearing gifts that would change her life forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The December wind howled across the frozen plains of the Dakota Territory, carrying with it the bite of an early blizzard that promised to bury the landscape in snow for weeks to come. Martha Henderson pulled her woolen shawl tighter around her shoulders as she stepped onto the covered porch of the small cabin she shared with her 12-year-old son, Thomas. The coffee in her tin cup steamed in the frigid air, creating small clouds that dissipated instantly in the relentless wind. At 34, Martha had been widowed for 3 years, ever since her husband Jacob had succumbed to consumption, leaving her to manage their modest homestead alone with their son. The cabin sat in a small valley near Crow Creek, about 20 miles south of the growing settlement of Pierre. It was isolated country, where the nearest neighbor lived a full day's ride away, and where survival depended on careful preparation, unwavering determination, and the grace of God. Martha had chosen to remain in this remote location, not out of stubbornness, but out of necessity. Jacob had spent their life savings purchasing this land and building their home, dreaming of the day when the railroad would extend through their valley, making their property valuable. That dream had died with him, but Martha couldn't afford to abandon the investment that represented their son's only inheritance. Instead, she had learned to trap, hunt, and trade with the occasional travelers who passed through their isolated corner of the territory. The winter of 1878 had been particularly harsh, with temperatures dropping below freezing in October and staying there. Martha's stores of preserved meat, vegetables from her garden, and traded goods were carefully rationed to last until spring. Every decision carried weight. Too much generosity could mean starvation, but too little humanity could mean losing the connections that made survival possible in such remote country. This morning felt different, though Martha couldn't immediately identify why. The wind carried sounds that seemed out of place, not the usual howl of air through bare branches or the distant cry of winter birds, but something that reminded her of human voices, though she knew that was impossible. No one traveled in weather like this unless driven by desperate circumstances. As she scanned the white expanse of prairie that stretched beyond her small cleared area, Martha's attention was caught by movement near the tree line that marked the beginning of Crow Creek's wooded valley. At first, she thought it might be a deer or elk seeking shelter from the storm, but as she watched more carefully, she realized the dark shape was too large and moved too deliberately to be a wild animal. Thomas appeared at her side, having noticed her intense focus on something beyond their normal view. At 12, he had already developed the watchful alertness that frontier life demanded, learning to distinguish between normal sounds and those that might signal danger or opportunity. "Ma, what is it?" he asked quietly, following her gaze toward the tree line. "I'm not certain," Martha replied, continuing to observe the dark shape that seemed to be struggling through the snowdrifts. "But I believe someone is out there, and they appear to be in considerable difficulty." As they watched, the figure stumbled and fell, then struggled to rise again before collapsing completely into the snow. Even at this distance, Martha could see that whoever it was had reached the end of their strength and would not survive much longer without assistance. "Thomas, go inside and stoke the fire, then prepare the extra bedding we keep for emergencies. Someone is going to need warmth and shelter, and they're going to need it quickly." Martha set down her coffee and retrieved the heavy rifle she kept loaded near the door. Not because she expected trouble from whoever was struggling in the snow, but because winter in the Dakota Territory held many dangers, and a person helping someone in distress could become vulnerable to wolves, bears, or other predators drawn. by the scent of weakness. The journey through the snow drifts to reach the collapsed figure took nearly 20 minutes of difficult walking. Martha's boots broke through the crusted surface with each step, sometimes sinking to her knees in the soft powder beneath. By the time she reached the tree line, she was breathing hard, and her legs ached from the exertion. What she found there stopped her cold. An elderly Native American man lay unconscious in the snow, his dark clothing and long grey hair partially covered by the white powder that continued to fall steadily. His breathing was shallow and labored, and when Martha knelt beside him to check for injuries, she could feel the intense heat radiating from his body even through the thick winter air. He was burning with fever, his face flushed and his lips cracked from dehydration. Martha could see that he wore the traditional clothing of the Dakota Sioux, beautifully crafted buckskin decorated with intricate beadwork and quillwork that spoke of high status within his tribe. More importantly, she could see that he was dying. Martha had encountered Sioux individuals before, during her years in the territory, though usually at a distance and always with a tension that reflected the complex and often violent relationship between white settlers and the indigenous peoples of the region. The Dakota War of 1862 had left scars on both communities that still influenced every interaction, creating an atmosphere of mutual suspicion and fear. But looking at this elderly man, Martha saw only a human being in desperate need of help. His age and the reverent way his clothing had been crafted suggested he was a person of considerable importance within his community, perhaps a chief, a medicine man, or an elder whose wisdom was valued by his people. Whatever his role, he was someone's grandfather, someone's teacher, someone whose loss would create grief among those who loved him. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Martha made her decision without hesitation. Lifting the unconscious man was beyond her physical capabilities, but she could provide immediate care and then figure out how to get him to shelter. She removed her own heavy coat and wrapped it around his body, then used her scarf to create a wind barrier around his head and face. "Hold on," she whispered, though she knew he couldn't hear her. "You're not going to die alone in this snow." Getting him back to the cabin required resourcefulness and determination that Martha hadn't known she possessed. She returned to the house and enlisted Thomas's help, along with 2 of their horses and a makeshift sled constructed from pine boards and rope. The journey back through the snow took nearly an hour, with Martha and Thomas taking turns breaking trail while the horses struggled to pull their improvised rescue device. By the time they got the elderly man inside the cabin, his condition had deteriorated significantly. His fever seemed even higher, and his breathing had become more irregular. Martha had experienced treating illness. Frontier life demanded such skills, but this was clearly beyond anything she had encountered before. Working quickly, she and Thomas got him settled on the bed in the cabin's small back room, removing his wet clothing and replacing it with dry blankets warmed by the fire. Martha prepared a weak broth from their precious stores of dried meat and vegetables, hoping to get some nourishment into him when he regained consciousness. But as the hours passed, the elderly man's condition continued to worsen. His fever climbed higher, causing him to alternate between violent shivering and periods of burning heat. He spoke occasionally in delirium, using words in the Lakota language that Martha couldn't understand, but which clearly carried great emotion. For 3 days and nights, Martha maintained a constant vigil beside the sick man's bed. She used cool water to try to reduce his fever, forced small amounts of broth and water between his lips during moments of semi-consciousness, and kept him warm during the periods when his body temperature dropped dangerously low. Thomas helped as much as a 12-year-old could, fetching water, tending the fire, and preparing simple meals that Martha barely had time to eat. The boy had inherited his father's steady temperament and his mother's compassion. accepting without, questioned that they were risking their own welfare to save a stranger. On the fourth night, Martha thought she was going to lose him. His fever spiked to a point where his skin felt like burning metal, and his breathing became so shallow that she could barely detect it. She sat beside his bed, holding his hand and speaking softly about anything that came to mind, memories of her late husband, descriptions of the beautiful valley in spring, stories about Thomas's growth and accomplishments. "I don't know who you are or where you come from," she said during one particularly dark hour, "but I know you're important to people who love you. They need you to fight through this. They need you to come home." Whether her words had any effect or whether the fever simply ran its course, Martha would never know. But as dawn broke on the fifth day, the elderly man's fever finally broke. His skin cooled, his breathing became more regular, and when Martha checked his pulse, she found it stronger and more steady than it had been since she found him in the snow. When he opened his eyes for the first time in 5 days, they were clear and aware, focusing on Martha's face with an intensity that seemed to look directly into her soul. "You saved my life," he said in English, his voice weak but carrying unmistakable dignity. Martha felt tears she hadn't realized she was holding back start to flow down her cheeks. "I just did what anyone would do," she replied, though they both knew that wasn't true. "No," the elderly man said, struggling to sit up despite Martha's attempts to keep him lying down. "What you did required courage that few possess. You risked everything for a stranger, and not just any stranger, but one whose people have been at war with yours." Over the following days, as the elderly man slowly regained his strength, Martha learned that his name was Tahatan Najin, Standing Moose, and that he was indeed a person of tremendous importance within the Lakota Sioux Nation. He was not just an elder, but a revered medicine man and spiritual leader whose wisdom was sought by chiefs and warriors from multiple tribes. Standing Moose had been traveling between winter camps when the blizzard struck, carrying medicine and performing ceremonies for sick children in remote villages. He had become separated from his escort during the storm and had been wandering in the snow for 2 days before Martha found him. "My grandsons believed I was dead," he told Martha as he slowly recovered his strength. "They will be searching for my body, preparing for mourning ceremonies. When they discover I am alive and learn how I was saved, they will want to express their gratitude according to our traditions." Martha assured him that no gratitude was necessary, that she had simply done what her Christian faith and basic human decency required. But Standing Moose shook his head with the patient smile of someone who understood cultural obligations that went far beyond individual preferences. "Among my people, a life debt of this magnitude cannot be ignored. You have given me back not just my life, but the opportunity to continue serving my community, to see my grandchildren grow, to pass on the wisdom I have accumulated over 7 decades of living. This is a gift that demands proper recognition." As Standing Moose continued to recover, he shared stories of his life and his people that gave Martha a perspective on the Dakota Territory she had never possessed. He spoke of the beauty of Lakota culture, the complex spiritual beliefs that guided their daily lives, and the profound connection to the land that white settlers often misunderstood as simple nomadism. He also spoke honestly about the conflicts between his people and the encroaching white settlement, acknowledging the legitimate grievances on both sides while expressing hope that understanding might eventually replace hostility. "There are good people among all nations," he told Martha one evening as they sat by the fire. "The tragedy is that the good people on different sides rarely have the chance to know each other. Fear and suspicion are easier than trust and friendship." After 2 weeks, Standing Moose felt strong enough to travel, though Martha worried that he was pushing himself too quickly, She had grown to appreciate his wisdom and gentle humor, and Thomas had become fascinated by the stories of Lakota life that the elderly man shared during his recovery. "I must return to my people." Standing, Moose explained, "They need to know I am alive, and I need to resume my responsibilities. But first, I must ask you to accept something." He produced from his clothing a small leather pouch containing what appeared to be herbs and other items Martha couldn't identify. "This is medicine made according to our oldest traditions. It will protect you and your son from illness and bring good fortune to your home. More importantly, it marks you as friends of the Lakota people. If you ever encounter any of our warriors, show them this medicine pouch and they will know you are under our protection." Martha accepted the gift with deep gratitude, understanding that it represented not just personal appreciation, but formal recognition of friendship between peoples who were often enemies. Standing Moose departed on a cold February morning, riding one of Martha's horses and carrying supplies she had insisted he take for the journey home. As he prepared to leave, he clasped her hands in his and spoke words that would prove prophetic. "What you have done will not be forgotten. Among my people, generosity creates bonds that last for generations. Your kindness to me will be remembered by my children's children, and they will honor you as I honor you now." Martha watched him ride away across the snowy prairie until he disappeared into the vast whiteness, wondering if she would ever see him again or learn whether he reached his people safely. She had no way of knowing that Standing Moose would indeed reach his winter camp, that his return would cause celebration throughout the Lakota nation, and that his account of her care would spread among tribes throughout the northern plains. She could not foresee that her simple act of compassion would create ripples that would affect not just her own life, but the lives of countless others who would benefit from the bridge of understanding she had helped to build. The spring that followed was unusually mild, allowing Martha and Thomas to plant a larger garden than ever before and to make improvements to their cabin that would increase their comfort during the next winter. Life seemed to be returning to normal, but Martha carried with her the memory of those 2 weeks when she had cared for Standing Moose and the understanding of Lakota culture that his stories had provided. That memory would prove invaluable when, on a warm morning in late May, Martha heard the thunder of approaching horses and stepped outside to see a sight that would remain etched in her memory forever. The thunder Martha heard wasn't from an approaching storm. It was the rhythmic pounding of 100 horses moving across the prairie in perfect formation. As she stepped onto her porch that warm May morning, her heart nearly stopped at the sight before her. A magnificent war party stretched across the horizon, their painted horses prancing and snorting, eagle feathers dancing in the morning breeze, and the morning sun glinting off ceremonial weapons and ornate shields. At the head of this impressive procession rode 2 young men whose bearing and regalia immediately marked them as leaders of extraordinary status. Both appeared to be in their 20s, with the muscular build and confident posture of seasoned warriors, yet their faces held an expression of solemn purpose rather than hostility. Behind them, arranged in precise formation, rode warriors whose painted faces and elaborate dress spoke of a formal ceremony rather than a war party. Martha's first instinct was fear. 100 armed Sioux warriors approaching an isolated homestead typically meant only one thing in the Dakota Territory. Her hand moved instinctively toward the rifle that stood beside her door, but something about the procession's deliberate, ceremonial pace made her pause. These warriors weren't approaching with the swift, predatory movement of a raiding party. Instead, they moved with the measured dignity of a formal delegation. Thomas appeared beside her, his 12-year-old eyes wide with a mixture of terror and fascination. "Ma, should we run for the root cellar?" he whispered, referring to the hiding place they had prepared for exactly such emergencies. "Wait," Martha said quietly, studying the approaching riders more carefully. Something about this isn't right. For an attack, look at how they're moving. It's too slow, too ceremonial. And see those items they're carrying. Those aren't weapons. Indeed, as the procession drew nearer, Martha could see that many of the warriors carried bundles, decorated pouches, and items that clearly weren't meant for warfare. More intriguingly, she could hear what sounded like singing, a rhythmic chanting that seemed to honor rather than threaten. The two leaders at the front of the procession raised their hands in a gesture that Martha recognized as a sign of peaceful intent. One of them called out in English, his voice carrying clearly across the morning air, "Martha Henderson, we come in peace to honor you. We are the grandsons of Standing Moose." The revelation hit Martha like lightning. These were Standing Moose's grandsons, the ones he had mentioned during his recovery. Somehow, they had found her remote homestead and brought with them what appeared to be the largest gathering of Sioux warriors she had ever seen or heard described. As the procession halted about 50 yards from her cabin, the two leaders dismounted and approached on foot, leaving their weapons with their horses in a clear demonstration of peaceful intent. The older of the two, a powerfully built man with intricate tattoos covering his arms and chest, spoke first. "I am Matoska, White Bear, eldest grandson of Standing Moose. This is my brother Wanatan, Swift Arrow. Our grandfather has told us how you saved his life during the winter of great snows, how you cared for him when he was dying, how you risked everything for a stranger." Martha found her voice, though it trembled slightly with emotion. "Your grandfather is a remarkable man. I only did what anyone with a heart would do. How is he? Is he well?" Swift Arrow stepped forward, his face breaking into a smile that transformed his stern features. "He is not only well, but he speaks of you daily. He calls you the woman who brought him back from the spirit world. He has told your story to every tribe from here to the Black Hills. You are famous among our people as a symbol of what is possible between our nations." White Bear gestured toward the assembled warriors behind them. "We could not let such kindness go unrecognized. Among the Lakota, saving a life creates bonds that last forever. You didn't just save our grandfather. You saved our teacher, our spiritual guide, the keeper of our family's medicine. His wisdom has already helped dozens more people since his return. We have come," Swift Arrow continued, "to offer you gifts that express our gratitude and to make you officially a friend of the Lakota people. What you did has changed how our warriors think about white settlers. They have seen that courage and compassion exist among all peoples." What followed was unlike anything Martha had ever experienced. The 100 warriors dismounted and arranged themselves in a great circle around her cabin, creating an amphitheater of sorts, with Martha and her son at the center. What she had taken for weapons were actually ceremonial items: eagle feathers, painted shields, beaded lances, and other objects of spiritual significance. White Bear explained that they had brought gifts representing different aspects of Lakota life and values. Each gift comes from a different family, a different band, sometimes a different tribe entirely. When word spread of what you had done, people traveled for days to contribute something to this ceremony. The gift-giving began with practical items that showed the deep thought that had gone into each selection. Beautiful blankets woven from buffalo wool and decorated with intricate patterns that told stories of Lakota history. Perfectly crafted moccasins made from the softest deerskin and beaded with designs that would identify Martha as a friend wherever she traveled in Sioux territory. But the gifts went far beyond material objects. A respected warrior named Thunder Horse presented Martha with a magnificent painted hide that depicted the story of her caring for Standing Moose, transforming her simple act of kindness into a visual narrative that would preserve the memory for future generations. This will be displayed in our council lodges, Thunderhorse explained through White Bear's translation. Children will learn from this story for generations to come. They will learn that enemies can become friends, that kindness creates strength, that one person's courage can change the hearts of many. An elderly woman, introduced as Grandmother Willow, had traveled 3 days to present Martha with a special medicine bundle. This contains herbs that will keep your family healthy, sacred stones that will bring good fortune to your home, and tobacco blessed by our most powerful medicine men. But more than that, it contains prayers. Prayers for your protection, prayers for your prosperity, prayers that the friendship between our peoples will grow stronger. Each gift came with a story, an explanation of its significance, and expressions of gratitude that moved Martha to tears. A young warrior gave her arrows crafted by his own hands, explaining that they would always find their target and provide food for her family. A noted artist presented beadwork of extraordinary beauty, saying that its patterns would bring her dreams of peace and happiness. But perhaps the most meaningful gift came from a group of children who had accompanied their parents on this remarkable journey. Led by a 10-year-old girl named Little Star, they performed a dance that told the story of Standing Moose's rescue and recovery. Their innocent voices singing in the Lakota language, their graceful movements capturing both the desperation of the winter crisis and the joy of healing and return. The children insisted on coming, Swift Arrow explained to Martha as they watched the performance. They wanted to see the woman who proved that kindness is more powerful than hatred. Their parents said this journey would be their most important. Education. As the ceremony continued, Martha began to understand that she was witnessing something historically significant. White Bear confirmed her impression, explaining that such a gathering represented months of planning and coordination between tribes that didn't always cooperate easily. Your grandfather's story created unity among us, he told her. Bands that had been arguing about how to respond to white settlement found common ground in honoring your kindness. Warriors who wanted only revenge began to believe that peace might be possible. You gave us hope that there are white people we can trust, white people worth protecting. The impact extended beyond the immediate ceremony. Swift Arrow described how Martha's story had influenced tribal councils throughout the region, leading to decisions that prioritized protecting friendly whites rather than treating all settlers as enemies. Several potential raids on isolated homesteads had been called off when warriors learned that the targets might include people like Martha. You have saved more lives than just our grandfathers, Swift Arrow told her. Your kindness created a ripple that has prevented bloodshed and protected innocent people on both sides of our conflict. Thomas, who had been watching the proceedings with wide-eyed fascination, was not forgotten in the ceremony. The young warriors took special interest in him, recognizing that he had helped care for Standing Moose and shown the same courage as his mother. A respected war chief named Spotted Eagle presented Thomas with a small bow crafted specifically for his size and skill level, along with a quiver decorated with symbols of protection and strength. This boy helped save our grandfather, Spotted Eagle announced to the assembled warriors. Among our people, he would be honored as a young brave who showed wisdom beyond his years. But the gift that touched Martha most deeply came near the end of the ceremony, when White Bear presented her with a beautifully crafted peace pipe made from red stone and decorated with eagle feathers and beadwork of extraordinary complexity. This pipe was made by our grandfather himself during his recovery in your home, White Bear explained. He worked on it every day as his strength returned, carving symbols that represent the bond between your family and ours. When tribes gather to smoke this pipe, they will remember your story and the peace it created. The pipe came with instructions that revealed the profound honor being bestowed upon Martha. She was being invited to participate in sacred ceremonies, to serve as a bridge between communities, to help other white settlers understand Lakota culture and values. Our grandfather believes you could help prevent the wars that everyone fears. Are coming, Swift Arrow explained. There are leaders on both sides who want peace, but they don't know how to build trust. You have shown that trust is possible. Your voice could help others find the path you have opened. As the formal gift-giving concluded, the warriors arranged themselves for a feast that had been prepared during the ceremony. Fires were built at respectful distances from Martha's cabin, and food that had been transported for this specific purpose was shared in a communal meal that included not just Martha and Thomas, but several neighboring settlers who had been drawn by the unprecedented sight of such a large Native American gathering. The neighboring settlers, the Morrison family from 10 miles east and old Henrik Larson from the Creek settlement, had arrived prepared for trouble, but found themselves invited to participate in a celebration unlike anything they had ever experienced. Martha watched with amazement as barriers of suspicion and fear dissolved in the face of genuine hospitality and shared humanity. Henrik Larsen, a Norwegian immigrant who had always feared Indian attacks, found himself deep in conversation with several warriors about hunting techniques and winter survival strategies. The Morrison children, initially terrified, were soon playing games with Lakota children, while their parents exchanged stories about the challenges of frontier life. "This is what your kindness has created," White Bear told Martha as they watched. White and Native American families interacting with increasing comfort and friendship. "You have shown that our peoples can live together in peace, that we can learn from each other instead of fearing each other." The celebration continued long into the evening, with demonstrations of horsemanship that left the white settlers amazed at the skill of Lakota riders, traditional dances that told stories of great hunts and spiritual journeys, and music that seemed to capture the vast beauty of the prairie itself. But the most powerful moment came when Standing Moose himself appeared, having ridden hard to join the ceremony honoring the woman who had saved his life. Though he was now 73 years old, he sat his horse with the dignity and strength that had made him a revered leader among his people. His reunion with Martha brought tears to the eyes of hardened warriors who had seen too much war and suffering. The elderly medicine man dismounted slowly, approached Martha with arms outstretched, and embraced her as he would embrace a beloved or daughter. "My heart has been full since the day you found me dying in the snow," he said, his voice carrying to every person present. "But today it overflows with joy to see how your kindness has grown into something beautiful and powerful. You have planted seeds of peace that will bloom for generations." Standing Moose then did something that amazed even his own grandsons. He removed from around his neck a sacred medallion that had been passed down through 5 generations of medicine men, a piece of incredible spiritual significance within Lakota culture. "This has been worn by the spiritual leaders of my family for over a century," he announced to the assembled crowd. "It carries the prayers and wisdom of all who have worn it before me. I give it now to Martha Henderson, who has shown that the greatest medicine is kindness. The greatest power is compassion. The greatest wisdom is love that crosses all boundaries." The medallion's presentation marked Martha as more than just a friend of the Lakota people. It marked her as someone whose spiritual authority would be recognized by tribes throughout the northern plains. It was an honor unprecedented in the relations between white settlers and Native Americans in the Dakota Territory. As the evening wound down, and the warriors prepared to make camp for the night before beginning their journey home, Martha found herself transformed not just by the gifts she had received, but by the understanding of what she had unknowingly accomplished. Her simple act of nursing a sick stranger had created ripples that extended far beyond her isolated valley. She had influenced tribal policies, prevented potential violence, and opened channels of communication that could help both communities navigate the difficult changes that were reshaping the Dakota Territory. The 100 warriors who had come to honor her would return to their homes, carrying new stories, new perspectives, and new hope that peace between their peoples might be possible. The white settlers who had witnessed the ceremony would spread word of Lakota generosity and dignity, countering the stereotypes that fueled so much conflict. But perhaps most importantly, Martha herself had been changed. The widow who had lived in isolation, focused primarily on survival and raising her son, had discovered that she possessed the power to influence great events through simple human decency. She had learned that small acts of courage could create large changes, that individual choices could shape the destiny of entire communities. As she prepared for sleep that night, surrounded by the peaceful sounds of the Lakota camp and holding the sacred medallion that represented her new role as a bridge between worlds, Martha reflected on the extraordinary journey that had begun with finding a dying man in the snow and had led to this moment of celebration and hope. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and responsibilities, but it would also bring opportunities to continue the work of building understanding between peoples who had too often seen each other only as enemies. The woman who had saved Standing Moose's life had discovered that in doing so, she had also saved something precious for everyone: the possibility of peace. The months following the great ceremony brought changes to Martha's life that she could never have anticipated. Word of the unprecedented gathering had spread throughout the Dakota Territory like wildfire, reaching military posts, territorial officials, and settler communities across hundreds of miles. Some viewed her new status as a bridge between cultures with admiration, others with suspicion, and still others with barely concealed hostility. The first test of her transformed circumstances came in early July when Colonel Marcus Whitfield, commander of Fort Randall, arrived at her homestead with a full military escort. Whitfield was a career officer whose reputation for decisive action against hostile tribes had made him both feared and respected throughout the region. His presence at Martha's remote cabin suggested that her newfound prominence had attracted unwanted attention from military authorities. "Mrs. Henderson," Colonel Whitfield announced as he dismounted from his horse, his bearing rigid with military formality, "I trust you understand why I've come. Your recent activities have created considerable concern among territorial officials." Martha received the colonel on her porch, wearing the beaded dress that had been among the gifts from the Lakota ceremony. The choice was deliberate. She wanted Whitfield to understand immediately that she was no longer the isolated widow who could be easily intimidated or dismissed. "Colonel, I assume you're referring to the ceremony honoring my care for Standing Moose. I can't imagine why acts of Christian charity and peaceful cultural exchange would concern military authorities." Whitfield's expression hardened at her direct challenge to his implicit criticism. "Mrs. Henderson, you hosted the largest gathering of armed Sioux warriors in territorial history. That gathering took place without military knowledge or approval, involving tribes that have been classified as potentially hostile. Your actions could be interpreted as providing aid and comfort to enemies of the United States." The accusation was serious enough to result in arrest and charges of treason, but Martha had anticipated this confrontation. During the weeks since the ceremony, she had consulted with territorial lawyers and studied the legal frameworks governing civilian interactions with Native American tribes. She was prepared for this fight. "Colonel Whitfield, I've reviewed territorial law extensively since your visit was announced. Nothing in federal or territorial statutes prohibits civilians from providing medical care to individuals in distress, regardless of their tribal affiliation. Furthermore, the ceremony you describe was entirely peaceful and focused on cultural exchange rather than military planning." Martha produced a carefully prepared document from her satchel, a legal brief that had been prepared by the territorial capital's most respected attorney. This analysis demonstrates that my actions were not only legal, but consistent with federal policies encouraging peaceful relations between settlers and Native American communities. The colonel examined the document with obvious frustration, recognizing that Martha had obtained legal representation that would make any charges difficult to pursue successfully. But his visit had purposes beyond legal intimidation. Mrs. Henderson, regardless of legal technicalities, your actions have created practical problems for military operations in this region. Sioux war parties now believe they can approach white settlements without fear of retaliation. Several raids have been planned based on the assumption that all settlers are as accommodating as you have proven to be. The implication was clear. Martha's kindness was being blamed for increased Native American confidence that could lead to attacks on less sympathetic settlers. It was a clever argument designed to make her feel responsible for potential violence while ignoring the more complex realities of territorial politics. But Martha had learned too much during her conversations with Standing Moose and his grandsons to accept such simplistic explanations. Colonel, my information suggests that recent tribal activities have been primarily defensive responses to increased military patrols and unauthorized surveying operations in areas guaranteed to Native Americans by existing treaties. Whitfield's surprise at her detailed knowledge of military operations was evident in his expression. Martha had indeed been busy during the months since the ceremony, using her new connections within Lakota communities to gather intelligence about the true sources of regional tensions. Furthermore, Martha continued, I've been told that several planned raids were actually cancelled when tribal leaders learned that the targets included settlers who might be friends of the Lakota people. My actions appear to have prevented violence rather than encouraged it. The colonel's frustration was mounting as he realized that Martha possessed information that contradicted official military narratives about regional security threats. Her transformation from isolated widow to informed advocate was more complete than he had anticipated. Mrs. Henderson, I didn't come here to debate policy with you. I came to deliver a warning. Your prominence among hostile tribes makes you a valuable target for those who would use your influence for destructive purposes. There are interests at work in this territory that view your bridge-building efforts as obstacles to their objectives. This warning proved to be prophetic in ways that neither Martha nor Colonel Whitfield could have foreseen. Within days of the colonel's visit, Martha began receiving visitors whose motivations were far more sinister than military concerns about territorial security. The first of these arrived on a sweltering August afternoon in the form of Cornelius Blackwood, a well-dressed man who introduced himself as a representative of the Dakota Development Company. Blackwood's expensive clothing and confident manner marked him as someone accustomed to wielding considerable influence, but his eyes held a coldness that immediately put Martha on guard. Mrs. Henderson, I represent certain business interests that are concerned about the impact of your recent activities on territorial development. Your influence among the Sioux tribes could be problematic for legitimate commercial enterprises that require clear title to disputed lands. Martha recognized immediately that Blackwood represented the kind of land speculation and resource extraction interests that Standing Moose had warned her about. These were men who saw Native American treaty rights as obstacles to profit, men who would prefer military solutions to diplomatic ones because warfare created opportunities for land seizure. Mr. Blackwood, I'm not sure what you're suggesting, but I have no interest in interfering with legitimate business activities. My concern is preventing unnecessary conflict between communities that could live together peacefully. Blackwood's smile was as cold as his eyes. Mrs. Henderson, peace is indeed valuable, but it must be the right kind of peace. The kind of peace that allows civilized development to proceed without interference from primitive peoples who don't understand the value of progress. The conversation continued for over an hour, with Blackwood alternating between veiled threats and offers of financial compensation for Martha's cooperation with his company's objectives. He wanted her to use her influence with Lakota leaders to encourage their voluntary relocation to more distant reservations, clearing the way for mining and railroad development throughout their traditional territories. Consider the benefits, Mrs. Henderson. Your cooperation could bring prosperity to this entire region. Railroads, mining operations, commercial development that would make your homestead valuable beyond your wildest dreams. All we need is your help in convincing the Indians that resistance is futile. Martha's response was immediate and unequivocal. Mr. Blackwood, I won't be part of any scheme to cheat people out of their rightful lands or to destroy communities that have lived here for generations. My friendship with the Lakota people is based on respect, not exploitation. Blackwood's facade of courtesy dissolved entirely. Mrs. Henderson, you're making a serious mistake. The development of this territory will proceed with or without your cooperation. Those who assist in that development will prosper. Those who obstruct it will find life increasingly difficult. After Blackwood's departure, Martha realized that her position had become far more precarious than she had understood. She was no longer simply a widow trying to survive on an isolated homestead. She had become a key figure in the struggle between forces that sought to exploit the Dakota Territory's resources and those who wanted to preserve existing communities and treaty rights. The pressure intensified when Martha received word that Thomas had been involved in a serious altercation at the settlement school he attended twice weekly. According to the teacher, several older boys had attacked Thomas, calling him an Indian lover and threatening to teach him whose side he should be on. Thomas returned home with a black eye and bruised ribs, but also with a story that revealed the extent to which community attitudes had polarized around Martha's activities. Some families viewed her friendship with the Lakota as admirable, while others saw it as treasonous. Children were reflecting the divisions that were tearing apart the adult community. "Ma, they said you were going to get us all killed by bringing Indians to our valley," Thomas reported, his young voice carrying confusion and hurt. "They said their fathers were going to make sure you stopped helping the Sioux before someone got scalped." Martha held her son close, feeling the weight of responsibility for the consequences her choices were creating for his young life. She had acted according to her conscience and Christian principles, but those actions were now affecting not just her own safety, but that of the child she loved more than life itself. The situation reached a critical point in September when Martha discovered that her homestead was being watched by unknown individuals who appeared and disappeared at irregular intervals. Horse tracks around her property suggested surveillance by multiple parties, while missing items from her outbuildings indicated that someone was monitoring her activities and resources. The mysterious watchers became bolder when Martha began receiving visits from Lakota messengers, bringing news from Standing Moose and his grandsons. These visits, always conducted with elaborate courtesy and obvious peaceful intent, were apparently being observed and reported to authorities whose objectives remained unclear. Martha's sense of growing isolation was relieved when she received an unexpected visitor who would prove instrumental in helping her navigate the increasingly dangerous situation. Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell arrived at the homestead on a crisp October morning introducing herself as a physician and educator who had traveled from Chicago specifically to meet the woman whose story had reached Eastern newspapers. Dr. Hartwell was unlike any woman Martha had ever encountered. In her mid-40s, she possessed an authority and confidence that came from years of professional achievement in a male-dominated field. She had served as a military surgeon during the Civil War, established schools for freed slaves in the post-war South, and now worked with various humanitarian organizations to improve conditions on Western frontiers. Mrs. Henderson, your story has attracted attention far beyond the Dakota Territory, Dr. Hartwell explained, as they sat in Martha's cabin drinking coffee and discussing the regional situation. There are people in Washington, in New York, in Boston, who see your friendship with the Lakota as proof that peaceful coexistence is possible. They want to support your efforts and protect you from those who would use violence to prevent progress. Dr. Hartwell brought news that both encouraged and alarmed Martha. Her story had indeed reached national audiences through newspaper accounts and magazine articles that portrayed her as a symbol of Christian charity and cross-cultural understanding. This attention had attracted support from religious organizations, women's rights groups, and humanitarian societies that wanted to assist her work. But the same publicity had also attracted the attention of interests that viewed her influence as a threat to their objectives. Mining companies, railroad developers, and land speculators were coordinating efforts to discredit her and eliminate her influence among Lakota communities. There are forces at work that view your friendship with the Sioux as an obstacle to territorial development, Dr. Hartwell warned. They have resources and connections that make them extremely dangerous. You need allies who can match their influence and protect you from their schemes. Dr. Hartwell's arrival marked the beginning of a new phase in Martha's transformation from isolated widow to regional leader. The physician brought with her not just moral support, but practical resources that would help Martha deal with the escalating pressures she faced. Most importantly, Dr. Hartwell brought news that Standing Moose had requested a meeting to discuss developments that were threatening both Martha's safety and the peace that their friendship had helped to create. Lakota scouts had reported unusual military preparations throughout the region, along with the presence of civilian contractors who appeared to be gathering intelligence about tribal activities and defenses. Standing Moose believes that some of the same interests that are threatening you are also planning actions against his people, Dr. Hartwell explained. He wants to coordinate responses that will protect both his communities and sympathetic whites like yourself. The proposed meeting would be dangerous for all involved, requiring Martha to travel deep into Dakota Territory, while Standing Moose risked exposure to military authorities who were actively seeking to arrest him on fabricated charges. But both understood that their individual safety was less important than preventing the larger conflict that appeared to be developing. As autumn progressed toward winter, Martha found herself preparing for what might be the most important journey of her life. She would be traveling not just to meet with Standing Moose, but to participate in councils that could determine whether the peace they had helped to create would survive the forces now arrayed against it. The woman who had once lived in isolation, focused primarily on day-to-day survival and raising her son, was now being called upon to play a role in events that could affect the lives of thousands of people. Her simple act of kindness toward a dying stranger had set in motion forces that were reshaping the relationships between communities throughout the northern plains. But with that influence came responsibilities that tested every principle she held dear and every skill she had developed during her years on the frontier. The choices she would make in the coming weeks could determine not just her own fate, but the future of everyone who believed that peace was possible between peoples who had too often seen each other only as enemies. Dr. Hartwell's presence provided Martha with the support and resources she needed to face these challenges, but the decisions and their consequences would ultimately be hers alone. The isolated widow had become a leader whose choices would echo through history, and the weight of that responsibility was both terrifying and inspiring. As she prepared for the dangerous journey ahead, Martha reflected on the extraordinary path that had brought her to this moment. Saving Standing Moose's life had been the beginning, not the end, of a transformation that was still unfolding. The true test of her courage and wisdom was yet to come. The journey to meet Standing Moose took Martha and Dr. Hartwell into the heart of Dakota Territory during the first week of November, traveling under the protection of White Bear and Swift Arrow, who had risked their own safety to escort the two women to the secret council location. The meeting place was a hidden canyon deep in the Badlands, chosen for its natural defenses and spiritual significance to the Lakota people. What Martha discovered there exceeded her wildest expectations. Representatives from dozens of tribes had gathered for what Standing Moose called the Council of New Paths, a historic assembly that included not only Lakota bands, but also delegates from the Dakota, Nakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho nations. Even more remarkably, the council included white allies, missionaries, teachers, doctors, and military officers who shared the vision of peaceful coexistence. Standing Moose, now 74 but still commanding in his presence, welcomed Martha with the warmth of a beloved family member. "The woman who saved my life has become the woman who might save us all," he announced to the assembled council. "Her courage has shown both our peoples that friendship is stronger than fear, that understanding can triumph over hatred." The council's purpose was revealed through 3 days of intensive discussions that opened Martha's eyes to the true scope of what they were attempting to accomplish. The gathering wasn't simply about preventing immediate conflicts. It was about creating an entirely new model for how different peoples could coexist on the American frontier. Dr. Samuel Morrison, a Presbyterian minister who had worked among Plains tribes for 15 years, presented documentation of successful cooperation between white and Native American communities in other territories. What Mrs. Henderson accomplished through her kindness to Standing Moose proves that such cooperation is possible here as well. But it requires systematic effort and protection from those who profit from conflict. Colonel James Patterson, a military officer whose conscience had been troubled by orders to conduct punitive raids against peaceful tribes, provided intelligence about the forces working against peaceful solutions. There are contractors throughout this region who are deliberately provoking incidents to justify military action. They need conflict to create opportunities for land seizure and resource extraction. The information Patterson shared was both alarming and illuminating. A network of civilian contractors, backed by Eastern investment capital, was systematically creating the very conflicts that military forces were then called upon to resolve. Innocent settlers and Native Americans were being manipulated into fighting each other while shadowy interests profited from the resulting chaos. Mrs. Henderson's friendship with Standing Moose has disrupted their plans, Patterson explained to the council. Her influence among both communities makes it harder for them to provoke the large-scale warfare they need to justify territorial seizure. That's why she's become a target for intimidation and elimination. Standing Moose rose to address the assembly with words that would become legendary among all who heard them. "My friends, both red and white, we stand at a crossroads of history. We can choose the path of our ancestors, fighting until one side destroys the other, or we can choose a new path that honors the best traditions of all our peoples." His proposal was breathtaking in its scope and vision. The tribes represented at the council would form a confederation dedicated to peaceful coexistence with white communities that shared their values. This confederation would establish formal, diplomatic relations with territorial and federal authorities, create joint settlements where families from different cultures could live together, and develop economic partnerships that benefited everyone involved. Martha Henderson has shown us what is possible when people see past skin color to recognize shared humanity, Standing Moose continued. Her kindness created trust where there was suspicion, friendship where there was hostility, hope where there was despair. We must build upon what she has started. The Confederation's formation required Martha to accept a role she had never sought, but could not refuse. The Council unanimously elected her as the primary liaison between Native American communities and sympathetic white authorities, a position that would make her one of the most influential women on the American frontier. Dr. Hartwell, whose own expertise and connections would prove invaluable, accepted appointment as the Confederation's representative to Eastern humanitarian organizations and women's rights groups. Together, they would work to build the political and financial support necessary to make Standing Moose's vision a reality. The first test of their new alliance came sooner than anyone anticipated. On the journey back from the council, Martha and Dr. Hartwell's party was intercepted by a force of armed men who clearly weren't legitimate military personnel. Led by a man calling himself Captain Johnson, these pseudo-soldiers attempted to arrest Martha on charges of providing aid and comfort to hostile Indians. White Bear and Swift Arrow immediately positioned themselves to defend the women, but Martha realized that violence would destroy everything they had worked to build. Instead, she chose to rely on the legal and political resources that Dr. Hartwell had helped her develop. Captain Johnson, if that is indeed your real name, I demand to see your authorization for this arrest, Martha said, with a calm authority that surprised even herself. I also demand that you identify the specific charges and the court that issued your warrant. Johnson's inability to provide legitimate documentation revealed the true nature of his mission. These weren't soldiers following military orders. They were hired contractors attempting to eliminate Martha before she could implement the Confederation's plans. When Dr. Hartwell threatened to expose their illegal activities to territorial authorities and Eastern newspapers, Johnson's men retreated rather than risk the scrutiny that would follow Martha's disappearance. The incident demonstrated both the determination of their enemies and the power of the allies they had assembled. Word of the attempted kidnapping reached sympathetic ears in Washington, D.C. within days, thanks to Dr. Hartwell's connections with influential humanitarian organizations. The result was federal protection for Martha and investigation of the civilian contractors who had been operating without authorization throughout the Dakota Territory. But the true measure of what they had accomplished became clear during the winter of 1879, when Martha's homestead became the site of an extraordinary experiment in cross-cultural cooperation. Lakota families, facing shortages caused by disrupted hunting patterns, were invited to winter near Martha's cabin. White settlers, initially fearful but gradually won over by daily interactions with their Native American neighbors, began participating in joint activities that broke down centuries of mutual suspicion. Thomas, now 13 and increasingly confident in his role as a bridge between cultures, became instrumental in organizing activities that brought children from both communities together. His fluency in basic Lakota, learned during Standing Moose's recovery, made him an effective translator and mediator when misunderstandings arose. "Ma, look at this," Thomas said one December evening, showing Martha a drawing that combined plains, Indian artistic traditions with European techniques he had learned in school. "Little Star taught me how to draw horses the Lakota way, and I taught her how to make them look like they're moving across the paper." The winter community that developed around Martha's homestead became a model for the kind of integration that Standing Moose had envisioned. Families shared resources during harsh weather, with white settlers providing tools and manufactured goods, while Lakota neighbors contributed hunting skills and knowledge of winter survival techniques. More importantly, the shared experience of frontier hardship created bonds of mutual respect and friendship that transcended cultural differences. Children played together regardless of their ethnic background. Adults collaborated on practical projects that benefited everyone, and gradually a genuine community emerged that honored the best traditions of all its members. Dr. Hartwell documented these developments in detailed reports that were published in Eastern newspapers and magazines, creating national attention for what became known as the Henderson experiment. Religious organizations, women's rights groups, and humanitarian societies began providing financial support for similar communities throughout the Western Territories. The success of Martha's winter community attracted delegations from across the continent. Government officials, military officers, religious leaders, and educators came to observe firsthand how peaceful coexistence could work in practice. Many left convinced that such cooperation represented the best hope for preventing the devastating Indian wars that seemed inevitable elsewhere. Standing Moose, despite his advanced age, made several visits to the winter community, serving as both spiritual guide and practical advisor for the experiment in integration. His presence lent legitimacy to the project among skeptical tribal leaders, while his wisdom helped resolve the inevitable conflicts that arose when different cultures attempted to live together. "What you have created here," he told Martha during one of these visits, "is what I dreamed of when I was young and foolish enough to believe that dreams could become reality. You have proven that my foolishness was actually wisdom, that impossible dreams can become beautiful truths." The impact of Martha's work extended far beyond her immediate community. Reports from military commanders throughout the region indicated significant reductions in hostile incidents wherever similar cooperation had been attempted. Colonel Patterson, now serving as official military liaison to the Confederation, reported that peaceful solutions were replacing violent confrontations in areas where Martha's influence had spread. But perhaps the most meaningful validation of their work came in the spring of 1880, when White Bear and Swift Arrow brought news that would forever change how Martha understood the significance of her simple act of kindness 3 years earlier. "Our grandfather, Standing Moose, has called a great gathering of all the Plains tribes," White Bear announced during one of his regular visits. "He wants to share the story of what has been accomplished here and to propose that all tribes adopt similar approaches to relations with white communities. The proposed gathering would be the largest intertribal council in Plains Indian history, bringing together representatives from tribes that had rarely cooperated in the past. The council's agenda would focus entirely on peaceful strategies for dealing with white expansion, using Martha's success as proof that such strategies could work. "You will be invited as the guest of honor," Swift Arrow explained. "Your story will be told to thousands of warriors and chiefs who have never considered that white people could be trusted. Your presence will demonstrate that friendship between our peoples is not only possible, but profitable for everyone involved." The invitation represented recognition of Martha's transformation from isolated widow to one of the most influential advocates for peaceful coexistence on the American frontier. Her simple decision to nurse a dying stranger had evolved into a movement that was reshaping relationships between cultures across the Western Territories. As spring turned to summer, Martha prepared for what would be the culmination of her remarkable journey. The Great Council would bring together leaders whose decisions would affect the lives of hundreds of thousands of people throughout the American West. Her role as primary speaker would require her to articulate a vision of the future that honored both Native American traditions and legitimate white interests. Dr. Hartwell helped Martha prepare for this momentous responsibility by connecting her with experts in law, diplomacy, and intercultural communication. But the most valuable preparation came from her daily interactions with the integrated community that had developed around her homestead, where she could observe firsthand what worked and what didn't in bringing different peoples together. The Great Council convened in July 1880 at a sacred site in the Black Hills, with over 2,000 Native American representatives in attendance, along with carefully selected white observers who had proven their commitment to peaceful solutions. Martha's arrival was greeted with ceremonies that honored her role in creating the possibilities that the council would explore. Standing Moose, now 75 and visibly frail, but still commanding in his dignity, introduced Martha to the assembled multitude with words that captured the essence of what she had accomplished. 3 winters ago, this woman found me dying in the snow. She could have left me to freeze, as many would have done. Instead, she risked everything to save the life of a stranger whose people had often been her enemies. That single act of courage and compassion has created ripples that have reached every corner of our world. Today, we gather to honor not just her kindness, but the power of kindness itself to transform hatred into friendship, fear into trust, despair into hope. Martha's address to the Great Council would be remembered as one of the most powerful speeches ever delivered on the American frontier. Speaking without notes, drawing upon 3 years of experience in building bridges between cultures, she presented a vision of the future that inspired even the most skeptical listeners. My friends, both red and white, we stand at a moment of extraordinary opportunity. We can choose to continue the cycles of violence and revenge that have brought so much suffering to all our peoples, or we can choose to build something new, something better, something worthy of the sacrifices that have brought us to this moment. She spoke of the children in her community who played together without seeing differences of skin color, of the families who had learned to share resources and knowledge across cultural boundaries, of the elders from different traditions who had discovered common wisdom in their diverse experiences. The path of peace requires courage, Martha continued, her voice carrying clearly across the vast assembly. It requires us to risk trust when trust seems foolish, to extend friendship when friendship seems dangerous, to believe in possibilities when possibilities seem impossible. But the rewards of that courage are beyond anything we can achieve through warfare. The Council's unanimous adoption of Martha's proposals for Confederation-wide peace initiatives marked a turning point in Plains Indian relations with white communities. Tribes that had been preparing for war instead began establishing diplomatic contacts with territorial authorities. Communities throughout the region began experimenting with the kind of integration that had proved successful around Martha's homestead. The woman who had saved Standing Moose's life had become the catalyst for a transformation that prevented countless deaths and created opportunities for cooperation that would benefit generations of children from all cultures. Her story became legend among Plains tribes, while Eastern newspapers celebrated her as proof that American values of compassion and justice could triumph over prejudice and exploitation. But for Martha herself, the greatest reward was not fame or recognition. It was the knowledge that her son Thomas was growing up in a world where friendship across cultural boundaries was normal rather than exceptional, where the courage to help a stranger in need could create lasting peace rather than temporary charity. As she stood before the Great Council, holding the sacred medallion that Standing Moose had given her and surrounded by thousands of people whose lives had been touched by her simple act of kindness, Martha understood that she had been transformed as much as she had transformed others. The isolated widow had become a leader, The frightened settler had become a bridge builder. The woman who had risked everything to save one life had discovered the power to save many lives through the courage to choose love over fear. The thunderous approval that greeted her words echoed across the Black Hills and beyond, carrying a message of hope that would inspire peacemakers for generations to come. In nursing a wounded Sioux elder through fever, Martha Henderson had discovered that the greatest medicine was not in any herb or treatment, but in the healing power of human compassion courageously applied. The months following the Great Council brought unprecedented changes to the Dakota Territory that validated Martha's vision beyond even her most optimistic expectations. The Confederation's peace initiatives had created a domino effect throughout the American West, inspiring similar movements in Colorado, Wyoming, and Montana territories. What had begun as one woman's simple act of compassion had evolved into a continental transformation of how different peoples related to each other. Martha's homestead had become the unofficial headquarters for what historians would later call the Great Peace Movement of 1880. Delegations arrived weekly from distant territories, seeking guidance on implementing the integration models that had proved successful in her community. Military officers, territorial governors, tribal leaders, and religious figures made pilgrimages to witness firsthand the miracle of peaceful coexistence that had emerged from the Dakota Prairie. But the most remarkable development was the establishment of what became known as Henderson Schools, educational institutions that combined the best elements of white and Native American pedagogical traditions. Dr. Hartwell had spearheaded this initiative, recognizing that lasting peace required children who grew up understanding and respecting multiple cultural perspectives. The first Henderson School opened in a large log building constructed jointly by white settlers and Lakota families, just 2 miles from Martha's cabin. Thomas, now 14 and fluent in 3 languages, served as both student and teacher, helping younger children navigate the unique curriculum that included traditional academic subjects alongside Native American history, philosophy, and practical skills. "Ma, you should see how excited the kids get when Grandmother Willow tells stories about the old days," Thomas reported one evening after a particularly successful school day. Even the white kids who were scared of Indians last year are now asking if they can learn to make bows and arrows like their Lakota friends. The school's success attracted attention from educational reformers throughout the United States. Delegates from Harvard, Yale, and other prestigious institutions visited to study teaching methods that produced children who were equally comfortable in multiple cultural contexts. These visitors often left convinced that the Henderson model represented the future of American education in regions where different peoples needed to coexist. Martha's role had evolved from teacher and mediator to something approaching a diplomat. She spent her days meeting with officials from Washington, D.C., who sought her advice on federal Indian policies, with territorial governors who wanted to implement similar peace initiatives in their regions, and with tribal leaders who hoped to establish confederation chapters in their own territories. The woman who had once struggled to manage a simple homestead now found herself coordinating activities that affected the lives of hundreds of thousands of people. Yet she remained grounded in the practical realities of frontier life, insisting that all policies be tested first in her own community before being recommended to others. One of her most innovative contributions was the establishment of trading cooperatives that allowed Native American artisans to market their work directly to Eastern buyers, bypassing the exploitative middlemen who had traditionally controlled such commerce. Lakota beadwork, Cheyenne silver jewelry, and Dakota pottery began appearing in fashionable shops from New York to San Francisco, providing sustainable income for tribal communities while introducing white consumers to the sophistication of Native American craftsmanship. "What you've created here goes far beyond preventing wars," observed Senator Charles Sumner during a visit to evaluate the Confederation's achievements. "You've demonstrated that economic cooperation can be more profitable than exploitation, that diversity can be a source of strength rather than division." Senator Sumner's endorsement led to federal legislation that provided financial support for similar initiatives throughout the Western Territories. The Henderson Act of 1881 allocated funds for integrated schools, cooperative trading ventures, and diplomatic exchanges between tribal and territorial governments. Martha found herself testifying before congressional committees, advising cabinet members, and corresponding with reformers throughout the United States and Europe. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from an unexpected source. In the spring of 1881, Standing Moose announced that he was writing a comprehensive history of Plains Indian relations with white settlers, and that Martha's story would serve as the centerpiece of his narrative. "Your kindness to me was just the beginning," he explained during one of their regular conversations. "What you've accomplished since then proves that individual actions can change the course of history when they're guided by wisdom and sustained by courage." Standing Moose's history, dictated to his grandson White Bear and translated into English by Thomas, would become one of the most important documents of the frontier period. Unlike previous accounts that focused on conflicts and confrontations, this history emphasized possibilities for cooperation and the individuals who had made such cooperation reality. The book's publication created international interest in the Henderson model, with delegations arriving from Canada, Australia, and South Africa to study how different ethnic groups could live together peacefully in frontier conditions. Martha found herself hosting visitors who spoke languages she had never heard, representing conflicts she had barely known existed, but all seeking the same wisdom about building bridges between divided peoples. The global attention brought opportunities that Martha had never imagined. Universities offered her honorary degrees, women's organizations invited her to speak at international conferences, and publishers competed for the rights to her autobiography. Yet she remained focused on the practical work of expanding the peace, Confederation, and ensuring that its achievements would survive the inevitable changes that American expansion would bring to the region. One of her greatest innovations was the establishment of the Mediator Corps, a group of individuals trained in conflict resolution techniques that drew upon both Native American and European traditions. These mediators traveled throughout the Western Territories, intervening in disputes before they could escalate into violence and teaching communities how to resolve differences through negotiation rather than warfare. Thomas had become one of the most effective mediators despite his youth, combining his multicultural upbringing with a natural talent for understanding different perspectives and finding common ground. His success inspired other young people from mixed communities to pursue similar careers, creating a generation of peace builders who saw cultural diversity as an asset rather than a problem. "Thomas represents the future we're building," Martha told a gathering of territorial governors who had come to study the Confederation's methods. "He doesn't see differences of skin color or cultural background as barriers to friendship. He sees them as opportunities to learn and grow. That's the kind of thinking that will make lasting peace possible." The Confederation's influence extended beyond immediate peacekeeping to reshape economic and social structures throughout the region. Integrated towns sprang up along major transportation routes, offering services to travelers of all backgrounds and creating prosperous communities that combined the best elements of different cultural traditions. Martha's original homestead had grown into the town of Henderson's Crossing, a thriving community of over 3,000 residents representing dozens of different ethnic backgrounds. The town's main street featured businesses owned by former enemies who had become partners, schools where children learned in multiple languages, and churches where different religious traditions were celebrated side by side. But the most remarkable feature of Henderson's crossing was its council system, based on Lakota democratic traditions but adapted to include representatives from all cultural groups. Decisions were made through consensus-building processes that ensured every voice was heard and every interest was considered. Visitors often commented that the town's government was more truly democratic than many eastern cities that prided themselves on their political sophistication. The success of Henderson's crossing inspired similar experiments throughout the American West. By 1882, over 50 integrated communities had been established using Martha's model, creating a network of peaceful settlements that served as buffers between areas where racial tensions remained high. Dr. Hartwell documented these developments in reports that were widely circulated among humanitarian organizations worldwide. Her research demonstrated that integrated communities were not only more peaceful than segregated ones, but also more prosperous, more innovative, and more resilient in the face of economic or environmental challenges. Martha Henderson has proven that diversity is America's greatest strength when it's managed with wisdom and compassion. Dr. Hartwell wrote in a report that was published in major newspapers throughout the United States and Europe. Her approach offers a model for how our nation can fulfill its promise of equality and opportunity for all peoples. The international recognition brought both opportunities and challenges. While Martha appreciated the support for her work, she remained concerned about maintaining the grassroots authenticity that had made the Confederation successful. She worried that too much attention from distant authorities might compromise the local relationships that were the foundation of everything they had accomplished. Her concerns proved justified when federal officials attempted to standardize the Henderson model through bureaucratic regulations that ignored the unique circumstances of different communities. Martha found herself fighting to preserve the flexibility and local control that had made peaceful integration possible, arguing that successful diversity required adaptation to local conditions rather than rigid adherence to universal rules. "You can't create peace through government programs," she testified before a congressional committee that was debating expanded federal involvement in territorial integration efforts. "Peace comes from personal relationships, built one friendship at a time. Government can support that process, but it can't replace it." Martha's testimony helped shape federal policies that provided resources for local peace initiatives while preserving the community autonomy that was essential for their success. The result was continued expansion of the Confederation movement, but with the grassroots character that had made it effective in the first place. By 1883, Standing Moose was nearing 80, and his health was declining. But his influence remained powerful throughout Plains Indian communities. He had become a revered elder whose counsel was sought on all major decisions affecting tribal relations with white authorities. His friendship with Martha had evolved into a partnership that had transformed the entire region. "When I was young, I believed that wisdom came with age," he told Martha during one of their final conversations. "Now I understand that wisdom comes from choosing love over fear, regardless of age. You chose love when you found me dying in the snow, and that choice has blessed thousands of people with peace they would never have known otherwise." Standing Moose's death in the autumn of 1883 marked the end of an era, but also the beginning of a new phase in the Confederation's development. His funeral brought together the largest gathering of diverse peoples in American history, with over 10,000 mourners representing hundreds of different communities that had been touched by his wisdom and Martha's compassion. The funeral became a celebration of what they had accomplished together and a renewal of commitment to the principles that had guided their work. Martha spoke at the ceremony, sharing memories of the elderly man who had trusted her with his life. and had given her the opportunity to discover her own capacity for leadership and service. Standing Moose taught me that every person we meet carries the potential to change our lives if we have the courage to reach out with kindness rather than turn away in fear, she told the assembled multitude. His legacy lives on in every friendship that crosses cultural boundaries, every child who grows up seeing diversity as normal, every community that chooses cooperation over conflict. The Confederation continued to expand after Standing Moose's death, but now under the joint leadership of Martha and White Bear, who had inherited his grandfather's role as spiritual guide for the peace movement. Their partnership represented the evolution of the Confederation from a response to immediate crises to a permanent institution dedicated to promoting intercultural understanding and cooperation. Martha's own transformation was complete. The isolated widow, who had once struggled to survive on a remote homestead, had become one of the most influential women in American history, a leader whose vision had prevented countless wars and created opportunities for prosperity that benefited all peoples of the region. But her greatest satisfaction came not from public recognition or historical significance, but from the knowledge that her son Thomas was growing up in a world where the courage to help a stranger in need was understood as the foundation of civilization itself. In saving Standing Moose's life, Martha had discovered that the greatest gift one person can give another is the opportunity to become more than they ever imagined possible. The woman who had nursed a wounded Sioux elder through fever had learned that healing requires more than medicine. It requires the faith to believe that broken relationships can be mended, that ancient enemies can become trusted friends, and that individual acts of compassion can create ripples of peace that transform entire continents. As she stood in her garden on a warm summer evening in 1884, watching children from a dozen different cultures playing together in the fading light, Martha understood that her story was not unique. Every person possessed the capacity to change the world through simple acts of kindness courageously applied. The only question was whether they would have the wisdom to recognize those moments when history waited for their choice between love and fear. The thunder she had heard on that distant May morning had indeed brought 100 warriors to her door, but they had come bearing gifts that proved more valuable than any treasure: the gift of friendship, the gift of peace, and the gift of hope that such friendship and peace could spread throughout a world that desperately needed both. The decade following Standing Moose's death witnessed Martha's greatest triumph and most profound challenge as the Confederation faced threats that would test everything they had built. The year 1885 brought news that would shake the foundations of their peaceful world: the completion of the Northern Pacific Railroad through traditional Dakota territories, accompanied by an influx of settlers whose numbers dwarfed anything the region had previously experienced. Unlike the gradual settlement patterns that had allowed for careful integration, this new wave of migration brought tens of thousands of people in a matter of months. Many arrived with preconceived notions about Native Americans shaped by sensationalized newspaper accounts and dime novels that portrayed all Indians as savage enemies of civilization. The delicate balance that Martha and her allies had spent years creating was suddenly under assault from sheer numbers. Martha, now 41, and recognized as the Confederation's primary spokesperson, found herself facing the greatest crisis of her leadership. The integrated communities that had flourished in relative isolation were now surrounded by settlements populated by people who viewed their multicultural neighbors with suspicion and often outright hostility. The first serious incident occurred in September 1885, when a group of newly arrived settlers attempted to force Lakota families from their homes in Henderson's Crossing, claiming that no decent white community should allow Indians to own property. The confrontation escalated quickly, with armed men threatening violence against families who had lived peacefully in the town for over 5 years. Martha's response demonstrated how completely she had mastered the art of transformative leadership. Rather than simply resolving the immediate crisis, she used it as an opportunity to educate the newcomers about the community's history and values, while reinforcing the Confederation's commitment to protecting all its members. She organized what she called a Truth and Reconciliation Gathering, bringing together long-time residents and recent arrivals for 3 days of structured dialogue designed to break down stereotypes and build understanding. The gathering featured presentations on the community's economic success, demonstrations of the educational innovations that had made their schools among the most effective in the territory, and personal testimonies from families whose lives had been enriched by cross-cultural friendships. But the most powerful moment came when Thomas, now 21 and preparing to establish his own mediation practice, addressed the assembly with words that captured the essence of what his mother had accomplished. "6 years ago, when I was 15, a man from Boston visited our town and asked me what it was like to grow up among savages," Thomas told the crowd. "I didn't understand his question because I had never met any savages. I had grown up among teachers and farmers, storytellers and craftsmen, warriors and healers. Some had dark skin and some had light skin, but all were people trying to build good lives for their families and their community." Thomas's simple eloquence, combined with testimonies from dozens of other community members, gradually shifted the atmosphere from confrontation to curiosity. Many of the newcomers had never actually spoken with Native Americans before, relying instead on stereotypes that dissolved upon contact with the reality of successful integration. The gathering's success led to similar events throughout the region, with Martha traveling constantly to facilitate dialogue between established communities and new arrivals. Her reputation as a bridge builder had grown to legendary proportions, with territorial officials regularly calling upon her expertise to prevent conflicts before they could escalate into violence. But Martha's most innovative response to the challenges of rapid settlement was the creation of what she called pioneer partnership programs. These initiatives paired newly arrived families with established residents who could teach them the skills and attitudes necessary for successful frontier life, while introducing them to the benefits of multicultural cooperation. The programs proved remarkably successful, transforming potential conflicts into opportunities for mutual learning and support. New settlers learned essential survival skills from Native American mentors, while established residents gained additional labor and resources for community development projects. Within 2 years, over 3,000 families had participated in partnership programs, creating bonds that strengthened rather than divided the growing communities. Martha's work during this period attracted attention from the highest levels of American government. President Grover Cleveland invited her to Washington, D.C. to advise on federal Indian policies, while Congress held hearings on legislation that would provide national support for integration initiatives based on the Henderson model. Her testimony before Congress became one of the most quoted speeches of the era, combining practical experience with moral vision in ways that inspired lawmakers from both political parties. "Honorable representatives, you have asked me to explain how peace between different peoples is possible. The answer is simpler than you might expect, but more demanding than most are willing to accept. Peace requires seeing every person as someone's beloved child, someone's precious grandchild, someone whose loss would create grief in hearts that love them. When we truly understand that our supposed enemies are mothers and fathers, sons and daughters, grandparents and grandchildren, we discover that we have more in common than we have in conflict. The speech led to passage of the Henderson Integration Act of 1886, which provided federal funding for multicultural education programs, economic development initiatives in integrated communities, and mediation services for regions experiencing ethnic tensions. Martha found herself appointed as the first Director of Intercultural Affairs, a position that gave her unprecedented authority to implement peaceful solutions to conflicts throughout the American West. But with authority came responsibility that tested Martha's wisdom and endurance. She was now overseeing programs that affected the lives of over 500,000 people across 12 territories, coordinating with dozens of tribal leaders, territorial governors, military commanders, and federal officials whose interests often conflicted with each other. The administrative burden was enormous, but Martha remained committed to the grassroots approach that had made her original work successful. She insisted on visiting every community that requested assistance, spending weeks at a time in remote settlements where her presence could make the difference between peace and warfare. One of her most challenging assignments came in 1887 when she was called to Montana Territory to address a crisis that threatened to destroy everything the Confederation had accomplished. A coalition of mining interests, backed by influential politicians, was attempting to force the Crow Nation from their traditional territories through a combination of legal manipulation and orchestrated violence. The situation was complicated by the fact that some Crow leaders, frustrated by years of broken promises from federal authorities, were seriously considering armed resistance that would certainly lead to devastating warfare. Her intervention required all the diplomatic skills she had developed over nearly a decade of peace-building work. She spent 3 weeks meeting with Crow leaders, territorial officials, mining company representatives, and federal mediators, seeking solutions that would address legitimate interests on all sides, while preventing the violence that seemed increasingly inevitable. The breakthrough came when Martha proposed what she called the Shared Prosperity Initiative, a revolutionary approach that would allow the Crow Nation to maintain sovereignty over their traditional territories while participating as partners in economic development projects. Rather than being displaced by mining operations, the Crow would become stakeholders in carefully regulated extraction activities that provided sustainable income while preserving the environmental integrity of their lands. The proposal required complex negotiations with multiple parties, each with different objectives and constraints. Mining companies needed assurance of stable operating conditions and profitable returns on their investments. The Crow Nation needed guarantees that their sovereignty would be respected and their cultural sites protected. Federal authorities needed solutions that would prevent warfare while maintaining legal precedent for similar situations elsewhere. Martha's solution satisfied all parties by creating a new model of economic partnership that preserved Native American rights while accommodating legitimate development interests. The Crow Mining Compact of 1887 became a template for similar agreements throughout the West, proving that resource extraction and indigenous sovereignty could coexist when guided by principles of mutual respect and shared benefit. The Compact's success enhanced Martha's reputation as the premier mediator of intercultural conflicts, leading to requests for assistance from as far away as Alaska and Hawaii, where similar tensions between indigenous peoples and American expansion were creating potential for violence. But Martha's greatest achievement during this period was not any single negotiation or policy initiative. It was the development of a new generation of leaders who shared her vision and possessed the skills to implement it. The Henderson schools had produced hundreds of graduates who combined multicultural understanding with practical expertise in conflict resolution, economic development, and educational innovation. Thomas had emerged as one of the most effective of these new leaders, establishing mediation practices throughout the West and training others in the techniques that had proved successful in his mother's work. His marriage to Swift Arrow's daughter, Flying Eagle, symbolized the deep personal bonds that had developed between formerly hostile communities. Other Henderson School graduates were making similar contributions throughout the region. Dr. Sarah Running Bear, the first Native American woman to receive a medical degree from Harvard University, was establishing clinics that served integrated communities while training a new generation of healthcare providers in multicultural medicine. James Ironcloud, a Lakota engineer who had graduated from West Point, was designing infrastructure projects that supported economic development while respecting traditional environmental practices. These leaders represented Martha's most important legacy, proof that her vision of multicultural cooperation could be sustained and expanded by people who had grown up seeing diversity as normal rather than exceptional. They were building careers and institutions that would ensure the Confederation's work continued, regardless of what happened to any individual leader. Martha's personal life during this period reflected the same integration of different cultures that characterized her public work. Her household included not only Thomas and his growing family, but also adopted children from various backgrounds who had been orphaned by conflicts throughout the region. White Bear, now in his 40s and a respected leader in his own right, had become like a brother to her, while Dr. Hartwell remained her closest advisor and friend. The extended family that had grown around Martha's original homestead represented the kind of chosen kinship that was becoming common in Confederation communities. Relationships were based on mutual affection and shared values rather than biological or ethnic connections, creating support networks that were often stronger than traditional family structures. But Martha's greatest joy during these years came from her grandchildren, Thomas and Flying Eagle's 3 children, who were growing up in a world where their mixed heritage was celebrated rather than hidden. 8-year-old Standing Bear, named for his great-great-grandfather, spoke 4 languages fluently and moved easily between white and Lakota cultural contexts. His sister, 6-year-old Morning Star, showed remarkable artistic talent that combined Plains Indian traditions with European techniques. Their youngest, 4-year-old Little Wolf, displayed the kind of natural leadership ability that suggested he might follow in the family tradition of peacebuilding. Watching them grow up gives me hope for the future, Martha told Dr. Hartwell during one of their regular conversations about the Confederation's long-term prospects. They don't see cultural differences as barriers to overcome. They see them as resources to draw upon. That's the kind of thinking that will make lasting peace possible. The children's easy navigation of multiple cultural worlds represented the ultimate success of Martha's approach to integration. They were living proof that people could maintain strong connections to their cultural heritage while building bridges to other communities. That diversity could be a source of strength rather than division when managed with wisdom and compassion. By 1888, the Confederation included over 200 communities across 15 territories, serving as home to more than 300,000 people from dozens of different ethnic backgrounds. The network had become largely self-sustaining, with local leaders handling most day-to-day issues, while calling upon Martha's expertise only for the most complex or sensitive situations. The Confederation's success had also influenced national politics, with both major political parties adopting platforms that endorsed multicultural integration as preferable to the segregation and conflict that had characterized earlier approaches to ethnic diversity. Martha found herself advising presidential candidates, testifying before Supreme Court cases, and corresponding with reform leaders throughout the United States and Europe. But her most meaningful recognition came from an unexpected source. In the autumn of 1888, representatives from over 30 Native American tribes gathered for a special ceremony to honor the woman who had transformed their relationship with white Americans. The gathering, held at the site where Martha had first found standing moose dying in the snow, brought together leaders who had once been enemies but who now worked together in pursuit of common goals. The ceremony featured the presentation of a sacred blanket woven by women from multiple tribes, incorporating design elements that told the story of Martha's life and work. The blanket would be displayed in tribal councils throughout the region, serving as a visual reminder of what one person's courage and compassion had accomplished. But the ceremony's most moving moment came when White Bear, now recognized as one of the Confederation's most important leaders, presented Martha with a special gift from his late grandfather. Standing Moose had spent his final years working on a detailed map of all the communities that had been touched by Martha's influence, marking each location with symbols that indicated the specific ways her work had brought peace and prosperity to formerly divided peoples. This map shows the true extent of what you have accomplished, White Bear told Martha as he presented the beautifully crafted document. Each mark represents lives saved, friendships formed, children who will grow up in peace because of your courage. Grandfather wanted you to see how far the ripples of your kindness have spread. The map revealed the extraordinary scope of Martha's influence, with marked communities extending from Canada to Mexico and from the Pacific coast to the Mississippi River. What had begun as a simple act of compassion toward a dying stranger had evolved into a continental movement that had prevented countless wars and created opportunities for cooperation that would benefit generations yet unborn. As Martha studied the map, tracing the network of communities that had grown from her original decision to help Standing Moose, she understood that her story was nearing its culmination. She had accomplished more than she had ever dreamed possible, but the work itself would continue through the institutions and relationships she had helped to create. The woman who had saved one life by nursing a wounded elder through fever had discovered that healing the divisions between peoples required the same patience, dedication, and faith that had sustained her through those critical nights when Standing Moose's survival had hung in the balance. The greatest medicine was not any herb or treatment, but the willingness to see past surface differences, to recognize the common humanity that connected all people, regardless of the color of their skin or the traditions of their ancestors. Up. Next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.